Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Nitzan, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, sure, Robbie. Hi, nice to meet you, and thank you for inviting me. It's really a pleasure being here. My name is Nitzan, and I'm a PhD student at the Consciousness and Psychopathology Laboratory under the supervision of Dr. Nitzan Theodor at the Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker and a mother of three.
Can I ask how you got, because I came across your research from maladaptive daydreaming. So I'm interested in how you came across the term maladaptive daydreaming.
So through my master's degree, Professor Eli Sommer was my teacher, and I was really interested in his work. He also a very, very important researcher in the field of trauma and dissociation. And I was working with traumatized women, and I came across a lot of his work, and I asked him to join his research, and he said, "Oh, that's so nice, but I'm not into this right now, and I'm researching maladaptive daydreaming. So if you are interested, you're invited, but that's what I do now." And I thought, well, if that's interesting for Professor Eli Sommer, then I'm in. So this is kind of how I got rolled into this area, and ever since it's making me very interested, and I really like researching uh, this phenomena.
Now, so you were pretty open to maladaptive daydreaming when you first heard about it. I find that with like other people, it's kind of, they're a little bit hesitant to look into maladaptive daydreaming or talk about it. They kind of go to something else, but it's interesting. You kind of accepted just because Ellie Sommer was going into it, which he's done incredible work on, but I've noticed all the research studies, a lot of stuff gets attributed to him. I mean, I think he even coined the term maladaptive daydreaming.
Yeah, he definitely did in 2002. And I am not sure I was that acceptive, as I was very curious. And it wasn't like, yeah, whatever he says, that's the truth. But it was, that sounds like there is something very interesting about that, and that we have a lot of things to explore about that, and maybe to find out new things. And that was very interesting for me to be able to participate in a study which is completely new, and nobody ever searched about it before. So I was very open, and through like the process, there were times that I was like, is that a real thing? Are you sure? And that was until I met people with maladaptive daydreaming, and then starting to realize, oh my God, this is so true. There are people that experience this exact thing, and they really do suffer from that. That they have a lot of trouble because of that. They find it impairing to their everyday life by maybe not being too attentive to their work or to their friends, or maybe kind of losing a lot of important time because they spend daydreaming rather than actually engaging in their real life. So you cannot dismiss someone's distress that easily.
Now, since you had past experience with trauma and people with trauma, did you think it might have been like the causation, one of the causations could be a trauma thing as well too? Like someone who has like PTSD or something of that sort?
So, to my opinion, trauma can be a basis for for a variety of pathological things that might happen to a person. So I wasn't sure if trauma is the only thing. And the more I was exploring, I realized that there are people who experience very negative events through their life that they think that were enhancing their tendency to daydream. But not everyone I meet report of negative events that actually influence their tendency to daydream.
How many people did you interview? Like, were people open about speaking that they had this form of daydreaming? I would have to feel like that would be something like people just go, oh yeah, everyone daydreams. It's like the common thing I always hear. I go, yeah, sure, people daydream, but there's also a line of it. And that's when we start heading into the maladaptive side of it, which is more intense.
Yeah, definitely. You're so right. Like, I guess that everyone daydreams from time to time, but the difference is between the frequency of daydreaming and how much you feel attached towards it. Like, how present is that in your life, and how much your life are centered around that daydreaming pattern. Do you feel like an inner urge to daydream, and do you feel upset when you're unable to daydream? I don't think every person that daydreams feel that way. I don't think that every person that daydreams find it impairing to their everyday life. You can find it relaxing, can find it like as a pause from your different activities and kind of time to maybe inspire creativity. So it's not have to be that way. But if we look at it as a continuum, like we do in psychopathology, almost in everything, like you can be sad, but if you're always sad, we might suspect you have depression. So you can see that there is a difference between people who normally daydream and people who have maladaptive daydreaming. As far as my study, so for my master's degree, I interviewed over 100 people with maladaptive daydreaming, and now as a part of my PhD, I stopped counting because it's a lot of interviews. But it's so I'm more into the details that I'm revealing rather than the numbers. But it's a lot of people. Yeah.
So through your study, what were you able to find? I know it links in with attention, but was that your first thought when you started interviewing people? Did they all kind of have what I would say, not a disorder, but did they all have something similar when it came to some type of like disorder or something like ADHD or anything?
So when we speak about attention in reference to psychopathology, we all tend to think about ADHD, which is very logical to think about ADHD. But when we speak about maladaptive daydreaming, so we can see that one of its key characteristics is the fact that it is impairing your attention, because you might be very, very focused on your inner fantasies and you know every detail and you can do it for hours and on. But it's like you're shifting your attention. Like if you had a flashlight, you're moving it towards the other way and forget to do other things because of that. So your attention to what happens in your, I don't know, social event might be impaired, or that you're not doing your homework at college, or you're not doing your work well enough, or you're procrastinating it because you tend to daydream all the time. So in one of Professor Sommer's and Dr. Soferdud's researches, they found that over 75% of the people who were diagnosed with maladaptive daydreaming were also meeting the diagnostic criteria of the DSM for ADHD. And when you see that high rates, you start thinking, wait, if they all also meet the criteria for ADHD, maybe they have ADHD and not maladaptive daydream. But it is different because not all people who have ADHD experience vivid, fantastical daydreams. They can have different things that kind of distracting them. Maybe they are occupied with the things they have to do because they feel they all the time leave things open and undone, or maybe they just feel restless, or any other reasons. But it's not typically characterizing everyone who have ADHD. So in my thesis, we asked, is that going to look like that in reverse? Like if we take people who experience ADHD and we'll check whether they have maladaptive daydreaming, would that be the same rates of 75%? And we checked that and we saw that it was definitely not how it was. Like only 20% or something like that actually met the proposed diagnostic criteria for maladaptive daydreaming. So it's not exactly the same. So we realized that those things might be different after all and not that similar contrasts.
I'm guessing it would be you would fall in the category of maladaptive. I mean, is it an experience? That's the main question. Is it something like someone learns? Like I would feel like if you haven't really ever explored your fantasy so deeply, it only gets more intense, I think, the more times you do it, at least in my experience. But with ADHD, I mean, a lot of people have it without the hyperactivity. I have it with the hyperactivity, but then if I'm not able to move, I'll just be hyperactive up here, if that makes sense. And that goes right into the fantasy where that becomes a little bit more intense. And then if you tack on the moving in the fantasy, doing a repetitive motion, sliding back and forth because I can't move my body, so I'm just doing like the same repetitive movement over and over again, and that fantasy only gets a little bit more extreme. So I'm curious if when we talk about ADHD or we talk about the prevalence, when you're able to separate the categories of ADHD and then maladaptive daydreaming, that 20%, you said it was 20% when you guys did it in reverse, that the people that were experiencing maladaptive daydreaming I mean, is there distinctive categories to be able to put someone and say that it's not just a subtype of ADHD? I mean, if
So,
it's so there's other disorders that obviously probably experience maladaptive daydreaming.
so you're right on the point. Like, how do you differentiate between the two, or how can you actually differentiate? Is it a subtype of ADHD?
I'm a bit confused. Yes.
It is a really important question to ask. So, to kind of answer that question, we need to kind of, I don't know, make it a little easier. So, what I'm researching is the thought patterns that characterize people with MD, with maladaptive daydreaming, and people with ADHD. Typically, in the scientific research of ADHD, your people with ADHD are described as dreamy or preoccupied or not listening, or their attention is somewhere else, right? But this is kind of the effect of not listening, but it doesn't tell us where do their minds go to, right? We don't know what they're thinking of. Um, and lately, we can see more and more research about the term mind wandering, which is kind of letting your thoughts roam freely and kind of jump from one thought to another without a certain course or aim. There is no guidance of the thoughts, like they can spontaneously arise, and it's like it's a very free thing that happens, right? But if we're
Like a
talking
sandbox, if you ever play a game where it's unlimited, anything you do.
exactly, so like there is no a specific goal to mind wandering, right? Because it's wandering. You cannot unify between wandering and a goal. It's kind of contradicting. So, but in opposed to that, when you were speaking of maladaptive daydreaming, we have a very specific thought pattern, which is kind of different, right? People are also the directors, and sometimes they are the actors of their scenarios, right? And they can navigate through the story. They can decide what daydream they want to daydream of, and what people do they want to have in their daydream, and how to end it. And if they don't like the ending, they can do it again and change it, right? So we're speaking of a much more guided thoughts that are coherent, and they evolve, and they also have a very big emotional reaction towards it, right? It's not only fragmented pictures that goes by. You can actually have an emotional reaction towards the story you're experiencing, like maybe going from feeling a little bit scared to then feeling very brave, and then very proud of yourself for doing something very heroic, right? We have a lot of people reporting about daydreaming of being involved in rescue actions or being heroes of something. So the emotion also changed, which is very different from just rapid thoughts that goes by. Um, so what I try to do in my research is kind of differentiate the patterns of the thought in order to kind of more understand the differences between maladaptive daydreaming and mind wandering.
How would you differentiate the pattern between someone's thoughts?
So I will ask them through like directly, how does your thought looks like? When I do it also when I interview people, but also through online questionnaires that I give people to answer. And in my study, we developed a new measurement scale that asks specifically about that. I'm asking about maladaptive daydreaming, and I'm asking about symptoms of ADHD, but I'm also asking, are your daydreams or different type of thoughts, are they scattered or are they continuous? I am asking people to elaborate about their thought patterns, their contrast constructs. So I'm asking forward, straightforward, and that way I get answers.
Do you find that there's I guess with maladaptive daydreaming, if there's a certain emotion that's more prevalent than all the others when it comes to their thoughts, like something that either someone's worried about could create the scenario that they're thinking about, or something like a deep desire that they might have. I find sometimes if I do a daydream, it's something that happens to do with something that's like popular. And I mean popular, it's like music related, or it's something where you're in front of a bunch of people. I don't know why, because I don't like public speaking at all, despite me doing a podcast, but it's like deep desire thing, I guess you could call it. I always wanted to do something music related when I was a kid. So I wonder if how many people have these fantasies. You can look at it from like what emotion that they're going off of, whether it's getting a new job or getting a career. I think I used the game Sims. Have you ever heard of that game before? Create a little family. A lot of people do that in their own heads when they, especially when they get older. Your dreams go from being a knight in shining armor to having a family, a 401k with a nice pool, an in-ground pool. That's what everybody wants. But then it's a whole different thing. But a lot of that is like emotion of either a desire for something or something of that sort. It doesn't always need to be sad, but it could be something like an emotional connection.
So we can see from people's reports about maladaptive daydreaming that the stories are usually accompanied by a positive emotion. It doesn't have to be a specific emotion like feeling happy or excited or proud or whatever, but it's a part of the a positive family emotions, and not it's not very recurrent that people exhibit negative emotions through their fantasies, although that also happens. Like, it is likely, like, it's like people enjoying horror movies, so that can also happen, but it's less likely. And the themes are usually related to feeling more accepted or more loved or more successful, that we can definitely report of. A lot of time people say that they kind of fantasize of their ideal self, and this is not that enjoyable at the end of it, because there becomes a gap between the ideal me and the real me. And that's a hard thing to have when you're a maladaptive daydreamer. This gap is only getting larger the more you spend daydreaming instead of doing things in your reality.
To add on to that, you might know this answer, but I'm just curious. Do you think that would create more depression? You can give me your personal opinion on that one, but I have to think being sucked out of a fantasy and all. Usually, the maladaptive daydreaming, from what I've understood, is that people kind of will give out on social situations. They'll do a bunch of stuff because the fantasy is sometimes better than reality. And I go, that makes reality a lot more unbearable if you really think about it. Especially, I would think someone with OCD could create their whole fantasy exactly how they want it, and everything's perfect. And then you go kind of into the world, and that's not necessarily how it works. So it could be a little bit upsetting.
So it is very interesting what came first. Did the depression came first and then you decided to escape into daydreaming world? Or were you starting to daydream and as a result, the gap got bigger, so you got more depressed? I don't have the answer to that, though I can say that my first study, and we found a very strong correlation between feeling more lonely and feeling having a lower self-image than people who were not maladaptive daydreamers. So I don't know what came first. We did not conduct any study that where we put different people in different situations, ask them to daydream, and then check their depression levels, and or put people in depressing situations, because that's unethical. But we can definitely see elevated levels of depression among people with MD,
Do you,
maladaptive daydreaming.
were a lot of the people that you interviewed, did they have lonesome personalities? People that spend a lot of time in social isolation? That's a big thing with ADHD, it's social isolation. I'm just curious if you, because I would think that's more time for you to be able to fantasize. But I've never really met anybody that, or heard any stories of anybody that's like super, super outgoing and then they just daydream all the time.
So that's really interesting, because it sounds like maladaptive daydreaming can be contradicting to ADHD in that sense, right? If you're more extrovert, then why would you spend a lot of time daydreaming? But I guess the answer might be that daydreaming is enjoyable and it is fun, and you can have a very satisfying experience if you're daydreaming of being more successful and loved and doing things you rather do than maybe doing your boring job. I don't know. So
It's the dopamine that comes with it.
it's very rewarding. This is why people keep on doing that, because it's very rewarding in short term. But in longer term, this is like a very vicious cycle of doing more of that, because you feel less pleasant in your reality. But if I go back to your question, I found people with maladaptive daydreaming to be more lonely. And again, it is hard to point what proceed what? Were they lonely, so they started daydream more, or they become more lonely because they're daydreaming more? I don't know what came first, but I can definitely say that they do experience loneliness, because if you're spending more time meeting friends on your imagination, or going to a date in your imagination because you're not sure of yourself, or you're scared of criticism, or you feel like it's such a mental effort to go to a date and realizing it's not for you at the end of it. So you become more lonely eventually. I do think that.
Do you think more people experience with maladaptive daydreaming? You think more people experience negative reactions towards it, or more positive reactions, like a comfort zone?
Like it's a short-term relief, but it's not a solution for their distress. I don't think, like, it is comforting while doing it, but afterwards people describe feeling very guilty because they were procrastinating things for a long time. They also describe embarrassment and shame, because it is hard to admit to your loved ones that sometimes you prefer not to be with them because you prefer to be in your own fantasy world. That could be very hard for people to understand, right? If you're in a relationship and you tell your partner that you rather spend daydreaming than actually be with him or her on your free time, that could be even insulting in some way if you don't understand the mechanism and the psychological reason for that. And I do have people with maladaptive daydreaming tell me they have an ideal relationship in their daydreaming world. And that's, I think, something that is really hard to tell people around you and to expect their understanding about that.
Now, you had a number of people come forward to you to do interviews. Do you think that there's probably a larger percentage of people out there that just don't feel comfortable discussing maladaptive daydreaming? It does kind of sound like when I would say something to somebody about daydreaming to get past 5 hours of cardio or something like that, they don't just look at me like I'm nuts, but they look at me like, you still daydream? Like it's a child's activity. And yeah, I understand it's good for children to do it, but also it's like I think everyone has a little bit of it. Just to what point does it really stop?
So I think people who comes to my study and participated do it because they want to share their experience, and because I'm a stranger to them. Sometimes it's easier because this is my field of research. So of course I will have more empathy than someone who never heard about that or is skeptical about that. So people usually are very authentic and open about their experience, and I really appreciate that, because that's something that like it's a very brave thing to do. But
It's a
people
sensitive
do
thing to do.
open their heart and tell me a lot. And this is how I learn about maladaptive daydreaming. This is how I got my understanding of it, mostly out of people who told me about their experience. And I, every time I meet someone, I'm amazed by the details about how much I'm learning from their experience. And when I'm writing an article, for me, it's kind of the way to give back and expose other people to this distress that people are observing, and kind of make this field more accessible for clinicians and people suffering from it.
Did any of the people that you interviewed discuss about maybe having more openness to talk about it with family members or something of that sort? Because since they were open about talking, it is a sensitive subject. When I mean sensitive, I mean it's very hard to reveal what you think about. If I say I dream about having superpowers or something like that, people look at you a bunch of different ways. But it is like, if that's me, and if it's, I don't know, an insight into who I am or what I think about or what I desire, I have no clue. But it's a sensitive subject, whether it's a fantasy about life or anything like that. So I'm curious if they were open about it with you, or would they be open about it, maybe discussing about talking with family members, just so we can educate more people around them to have more of a safety barrier for it. So it didn't just, because what you mentioned about someone like, it's hard to say, hey, I'd rather be in my fantasy than be with my family. That hurts. That's very, very painful for whoever's on either the receiving or the giving end of that. But I'm just curious if there's going to be, could we have a wall of protection with family members if people understood it more? Obviously, it has to be more accepted in terms of like society, the word maladaptive daydreaming. But, I feel like if more people understood about it, especially family members, I would just encourage people who experience maladaptive daydream to go home and talk to a family member about it. Like, hey, check out this research. And then maybe it'll give you some insight on what I do when I'm just staring off out a window or something.
Definitely, I think the way to make people more open and understanding is give them knowledge about that. So I tend to give people my published work and other and links to other published works so they can share this with other people. Sometimes it's easier to explain through what other people wrote than actually explaining in your own words. Um, but yeah, it's hard for people sometimes to be disclosed in front of family members and even their therapists, because again, this is somewhat a newly identified psychopathology and it's not officially recognized by the ICD or the DSM. So uh, people frequently say they were dismissed by their therapists, and that's really a shame, because if you're open to hear about your patient's experience, you might help them better, or you might kind of search for excessive daydreaming that way, find out more about that. So yeah, definitely knowledge is the way to more power and more acceptance with your surroundings.
Was
I do advise to people not to stay alone with their distress ever, because loneliness does never make things better. So I always say, if you have someone you trust and you can share things with, do it, so you won't stay alone with it.
was there anything about your study that landed in more of the fringe realm, or something that just didn't come up with the right amount of evidence, or something that was inconclusive, like that there's no connection here at all with maladaptive daydreaming?
So my study was trying to differentiate mind wandering from daydreaming, because those terms are kind of vague in the research field. And like I thought that maladaptive daydreaming has different characteristics that are different from ADHD, and not everything that I thought was inclusively was I couldn't find it like it wasn't very clear. For example, the ability to control your daydreaming is kind of a thing. It's kind of a thing that we don't completely understand yet. How much control you have over it. Because on the one hand, it can be seen as a behavioral addiction, right? Like you are addicted to fantasizing, and the more you do it, the more you want to do it. But the more you do it, the more it is hindering your real life. So it seems like you don't have a lot of control over it, right? But on the other hand, you do control where you do it, because you won't necessarily walk around or do mouthing when you're in your classroom daydreaming, or you decide to daydream when you're alone in your room, because then you know no one will disturb you. So there is an amount of control there, where you can decide what you want to daydream of. You can choose a specific music to daydream with. So we're not yet sure about the controllability of that. That is still an unanswered question.
Well, the link with attention, I only daydream in things I don't want to be in that situation of. I won't do it when I'm in my room. I won't do it if I'm at home and I have my phone or whatever. I won't daydream. I mean, I will mindlessly scroll for hours and hours, but if I'm like in class or something daydreaming, I'll just stare at a blackboard and just kind of look like I'm paying attention. But if you ask me a question, I won't hear it. So I wonder, like, if you just choose it, like, I mean, the attention thing, ADHD, I would say, it's attention deficient or a lack. It's just our attention's focused on something else. Usually it has to interest us for us to be, because there's the hyper focus side of it and everything like that as well too. So I would think with maladaptive daydreaming, if there are people who have ADHD and experience maladaptive daydreaming, they're choosing certain points of where they want to go when it comes to daydreaming. Like if you're in a, I don't know, something you don't want to be there for. Because if you watch a movie, I'm 100% tuned in, even if I don't like the movies, because there's just so much going on.
So I think there is a variety both for ADHD and maladaptive daydreamers in that. Most people, when they describe their difficulty with staying focused on a movie, for example, so if I ask a person with ADHD, they usually tell me that is maybe it's not interesting enough, or maybe they have their mental to-do list on their head and they're finding it really hard to stay seated and not be worried about the things they must do later on, or the things they did not complete on doing, or they just feel, I don't know, like their mind is occupied with suddenly with different things. Well, if I speak with people with maladaptive daydreaming, it's not hard for them to focus, but their imagining of the movie scenarios can be much more interesting in their own head, right? They can change the movie plot in any way they want to. I don't find people with ADHD do that when they wander off a movie, okay? Unless they have both ADHD and maladaptive daydreaming, which I have to say that also happens. I do believe people can suffer from both distress. Like they can be, on the one hand, very distracted by external stimuli, like from noises or conversations, or find it difficult to organize tasks and activities, right? But at the same time, they can also be very tempted to go into their inner world and fantasize for a long time. So that happens, but I think this is a much more complicated situation where you suffer even more because you're not regulating your thoughts in any way. And this is very hard.
How do you get, because I know ADHD is more prevalent with addiction issues, but how do you get someone to, like, I wouldn't say a treatment, but how do you get someone to stop doing the daydream so much? The only thing I could think of was, I don't know, if I make my day better, like if I have a bunch of stuff planned that I know I have to do or it's fun to do, then I won't daydream at all. But if I'm doing stuff like working or something like that, mostly sit behind a front desk. So I just kind of, tune out for, an hour or so. But I would have to think like, I mean, obviously it can really hinder some people's lives and cause some serious issues with it. But how can you do if we never really talked about daydreaming in a sense of it being ever bad, just don't do that or something like that. We kind of swooped it away. So when you're talking about maladaptive daydreaming, I've said even maybe changing the name a little bit. It's a good name, but I just think there's a stigma behind just the daydreaming aspect that goes with it. But when you recognize someone doing it, what's a way that you could just find something to get their attention back onto this reality instead of spending so much time in there? Because once you go down that rabbit hole, especially with ADHD, of hopping into a little fantasy and you really, really enjoy it and you keep going back to it and back to it and back to it, you're not only making it stronger, but you're also making it something that you need to start doing. And that's a really big problem.
So if we are talking about the daydreaming rather than mind wandering, okay, if we speak about people who also have adaptive daydreaming and ADHD, and
Mind
we
wandering
think,
is just thinking about things that you're going to do later, right? Isn't that like if I have to go get gas in my car, then I'm thinking about, oh, I got to go get gas when I get off work and get groceries. That's mind wandering.
so they're like different, like there is a like different researchers define mind wandering in a different way. There are a group of researchers that define mind wandering as an umbrella term for a lot of thought patterns, and others that define daydreaming quite specifically. I go with the other group, who tends to identify mind wandering as a specific type of thought that is characterized by spontaneous thoughts, not coherent, usually jump from one thing to another, unguided, where daydreams are fantastical images and stories that usually attend unrealistic or things that are unlikely to happen in real life, right? Like it can involve fictional characters in real scenarios or real people in scenarios that wouldn't happen in real life. So if we are speaking about daydreaming as an addiction, as a behavioral addiction, how do you stop doing it? I don't know. There is no protocol yet for treating maladaptive daydreaming, as it is not yet an official diagnostic disorder. But I can assume that if you're trying to kind of regulate your thought, that might be a helpful way to try and not let your mind go off to the fantasy, or kind to try to limit it. But I don't know how like what's the answer to that yet. I think there's a lot of research to do to find out what can be most helpful for people regarding their daydreams. And I think that can be different from mind wandering because daydreams involve your emotional needs, right? We spoke about maladaptive daydreaming of emotional scenarios of being more accepted and more loved and being more successful. So there is emotional need for that. Like maybe I feel lonely and I want to feel more loved, or maybe I had a family that was not able to satisfy my emotional needs. So I'm daydreaming of the perfect family. So like there is an emotional aspect of that I think we should um, take under consideration when we think about how to help people with their maladaptive daydreaming.
Is out of the number of people you interviewed, is there a certain age range that they all kind of fall in? Like, is there a very low age compared to a high age, or is there just a medium of a certain particular group?
So I think there's a bias because people find my research through the internet, and the older you get, I think the less time you spend on the internet, or you're less likely to know how to use Facebook or Reddit or whatever. So I think there is a bias there. So I can say that people that are younger tend to have more maladaptive daydreaming. But in my studies, I usually have younger people that experience that, like in their 20s and 30s, because I only interviewed adults. But I also interviewed older people, like 50 years old, 60 years old, that told me about their experience, and it wasn't easier for them. And feeling in the closet for so long was actually more distressful from being a young person that can search about it in the internet and find a lot of I don't know, comfort by knowing that other people also experience that.
I would have to think it's probably multifactorial because what I was kind of heading at was the number, what if there was a particular age range that more people experience this form of daydreaming? Because I don't, with ADHD, I learned that like apparently your brain doesn't fully develop until like you're in your, I wouldn't say mid 30s, but early 30s. I came across that research and I've been told that before by an ADHD psychologist. I think he was a psychologist. So that was interesting because I thought it was 21 or 20 in your 20s when your brain fully develops, but there's like a maturity level that's kind of like different, I guess, which means all the stupid jokes I have kind of makes a little bit more sense now. But I was wondering because the number of people in their 20s that have, I wouldn't say, especially now maybe, but have a little bit of a inner angst or something of like, what are they going to be, trying to figure out that existential crisis moment. And then it's really easy to push those problems away if you kind of go in your head and do the little fantasy thing or act it out in your head or do something. It doesn't have to always be a movie script, could be life stuff. But then if you go to the older section of people that experience stuff, I mean, could that just be boredom as well too? You get stuck into your fantasies. I mean, a lot of older people tend to not have so close as friends as you did in high school. You think you start figuring that out in your 20s. So I'm sure it's multifactorial on that one, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts on everything I just said.
Like on the people
Call me
I
stupid.
interviewed.
It's okay. I won't be offended.
No, not at all. This is so interesting to speak about. Like, thank you so much for the opportunity and asking so many interesting questions. Um, so when I interview people that recognize themselves as having ADHD, usually it is people age 30 and over, and with an average age of, I don't know, 35 or maybe more. And when I interview people with maladaptive daydreaming, it's people much younger. But I think the reason is because they are more likely to be in social media and kind of hear about that through that, because you have maladaptive daydream support groups through the Facebook and Reddit, and which is something that is more characterizing young people and older people to try to find their comfort with other people through social media. Um, and I don't think the maladaptive daydreaming thing is because you're confused through your young, through being young. Because most people report that they started daydreaming in such a way since they were young kids. Okay, so like they say, like every child have an imagination and daydreams, right?
Yeah,
But
imaginary
not every,
friends.
yeah, imaginary friend, that's completely normal. So I believe that not every child spends hours and on daydreaming while walking in their room back and forth. So that's a little different. And most people with maladaptive daydreaming do tell me I was like that since I was very young, since I can remember myself. So I don't think it's necessarily young age related, like your 20s or something like that.
See, that to me, when you say that, I start thinking of social isolation. A lot of times, if you spend a lot of time alone, you kind of spend a lot of time with your thoughts, and that just becomes the normal routine. Like, it doesn't mean that they're just people that just hate other people. I'm not saying that, but if you spend a lot of time by yourself, whether it's certain situations, I mean, some people are limited. If they're a kid, they only have a bike. They can't go to a friend's house who might be a town over. So then they have to stay inside on the weekends and maybe their family's out or something like that. Like I was raised by two DJs. So it makes sense why I spent a lot of time with my thoughts when I was a kid or playing video games or something like that. But you mentioned social media. Can that be an aggressor or a catalyst to the creation of maladaptive daydreaming or just something like that? Like I know there's people out there that see something go, oh, I have this. I hear it all the time whenever I mention I have ADHD and someone just goes, oh, I think I have a bit of that too. I'm like, fantastic, great, we're friends, cool. But there's a lot of stuff when it comes to like maladaptive daydreaming where, like I said, I even question if I have that just because I can use it in particular moments. Like a cardio or something like that. But some of the stories I've seen, people are experiencing it on a way worse level than I have, which makes me question, is there even significance in me saying that I have it if I just experience it in certain situations? So I'm curious if the social media thing is either a help or a hurt.
I don't know if social media is enhancing this phenomenon, but I can tell that the people I interviewed, they were very sincere about their experience. I don't think they they have no motive to make me think they have it and don't have it actually, because they didn't get any money for being interviewed. I was only listening to them. So I don't think there was like an incentive to lie about their experience or to think they have it even though they didn't. Usually people say, like when I start asking about maladaptive daydreaming, like through the first question, I can see in their eyes and in their answer that they know I know what we're going to speak about. Like finally, someone is speaking about that, about the fantasy things, not about the depression, not about the anxiety, not about the attention difficulties, about the fantasies and their effect on a person's life. So I don't think that the internet made it worse or inflate the rates of people characterizing themselves as maladaptive daydreamers. But I do think that you need to be careful not to diagnose yourself through Google, right? This is very dangerous. Like every time you feel pain in your body, it's like, ooh, cancer. So this is not a good way to diagnose yourself. It's a way to gain more knowledge about things, but I wouldn't say it's a good way to give yourself a diagnosis without consulting someone who is professional. And I agree that many people use ADHD as kind of I don't know, like a term that defines everything you do not in order, which is definitely not the situation for people with ADHD. They do suffer a lot from it in a variety of areas of functioning. So I wouldn't say everybody who fails to give attention to something boring have ADHD also.
What I
But
meant
I
by the thing about the maladaptive daydreaming, I wasn't saying people were doing it for attention to be like, I have maladaptive daydreaming, but sometimes you come across a video or something on social media and they're explaining maladaptive daydreaming, but it's not done properly. I've seen it with ADHD multiple times where like ADHD symptoms, and then it's like depression, anxiety, and then it's like this and this. And I'm like, shit, everyone has depression. Like, I mean, a lot of people have it and experience it and don't have ADHD. Like if I hit my vape or something, I had someone who's an ADHD psychologist be like, like you can be, are you addicted to those things? I'm a little bit concerned. I'm like, everyone in their 20s has either a vape in their pocket or two at home. I don't know, but it's not like an addictive thing. So I start going, it's not necessarily a misdiagnosis, but sometimes someone comes across something and it's a symptom or it's a subtype or it's something that goes along with a bigger thing and they think it's that. Well, I mean, there's plenty of other disorders out there that experience depression and things of that sort. So it might not be like they're like, oh my God, I'm having this and I'm going to get attention for it. What I'm saying is they see it and they go, that could be me. Maybe that's what I have. And then you go down the long route until you end up figuring out, oh, wait, I don't have that. That's just a different thing. That's what I meant. I wasn't trying to discern anybody that had a experience. I wanted to clarify that because that would make me rude as hell. I don't want to be like that.
So I think most people like when they go into the groups for maladaptive daydreaming, like if they really suffer from it, they will find it very quickly very similar to their experience. And if they're not, it will seem strange or unfamiliar or not really related to their experience. But again, I think that also it is always important to consult someone who is expert in psychology or I don't know, in any other field of of your mental health to make sure that you're not just I don't know taking labels for yourself that are not right and not going to help you eventually. So that is important.
What do you think about video games? I feel like the number of people that probably get soaked into those video games, like I could play video games for, I mean, it would feel like a whole day would just go by. And I feel like, I don't know, like 10 minutes or something like that. You get sucked into them. I mean, that's the same thing you could explain about with some of these fantasies. Sometimes you get sucked right into it and then your whole day goes by. So I have to think about the number of people that probably could be daydreaming, but they have a video game, an Xbox or something like that, where they can actually just physically be able to move around a character and get a different whole experience, much like watching a movie, except you're not dreaming different scenes about it. You're kind of just in it and you're able to actually move the people around. So it's more physical.
So I think that is really important as a way to kind of differentiate maladaptive daydreaming from ADHD. When you are hyper focused on external thing like a video game, it is external thing. It's not something that you imagine inside your head, right? You're spending hours and on external something that is very interesting for you. While for people with maladaptive daydreaming, their attention is focused inwards toward their inner reality, not their surrounding things. Like they won't watch a movie for hours because they can have a much better movie in their own head. They can just close their eyes and start imagining for a long time. So this is kind of also an aspect that I think might be differentiating ADHD from maladaptive daydreaming. The focus is inwards rather than outwards. So that's definitely different. Maybe the shared mechanism is the fact that it is addictive, that you spend doing it and it's fun and it's enjoyable. So you do it more and more, even though it's not very helpful to promote you in your real life. Maybe that can be the common factor, but they are essentially different when you're focusing about something in your external reality than in your inner reality.
So with maladaptive daydreaming, they can't get sucked into video games as much as they can get sucked into their own fantasies. But with ADHD, it kind of seems like if the video game won't interest me or if it's not fun anymore, I can put it down and then I'll go back into my fantasy and get 100% sucked into that. ADHD is so weird because it's that masking thing that I didn't know about. Like there'd be certain ways I'll have to be like, this is how I'm going to act in public today so I don't seem like a nut job. And then next thing you know, you start figuring out that's just, I don't know, I'm kind of dumbing down my personality. Like people who actually know me and experience me, I'm much like how I am on the show and everything like that. But at work, I can't do that. I can't be all over the place on that. So maladaptive daydreaming, it's not like with ADHD. So you can't just get sucked into a video game like I could. And then if that video game bores me, I could just tune it out and go into the fantasy. It's just which one's going to give me the more stimulant, which one's going to make me feel something more. Sometimes video games will, or sometimes the daydream is a lot better than playing a game where I could do whatever I wanted in it.
So I think like the instinct or like the tendency in maladaptive daydreaming is not towards the gaming, but more towards imagination. While in ADHD, I think that's more towards the out things in your reality. Like it's a movie, it's a game, it's something external. And if you do exhibit maladaptive daydreaming and ADHD, it can be both, which can be really hard to find yourself concentrating on what you really have to do. But I think people with maladaptive daydream usually tells me when I interview them that they won't even go to playing because they can do much more interesting things in their own head. They can imagine playing in whatever they want to in their mind, and they're not it's not restricted to the game's rules, right? They can make the rules themselves. So they are much more alert to be imagining things they want to happen or interesting for them happening or kind of have new experiences they know they can never have in their real life.
To be honest, that's how I rationalize like social situations. If I don't want to go to a bar and spend money, I just go, I'll just go, I'll just have the scenario go play in my head or something like that. It's cheaper to stay at home anyway, but I don't know. That might not be the same exact thing.
No, but the question is, do you usually prefer to stay at home and daydream than actually engage in social activities? If you find yourself not having social life because you rather have them in your own imagination, then we have to stop and think about it for a minute. How much is that impairing your social life? Because when we are thinking of psychopathology, we're saying is that hindering my functioning in different areas? And is that stressful for me, right? If it's not stressful, if I only enjoy daydreaming, it's not affecting any important area of functioning, then it wouldn't be maladaptive, it will be daydreaming, and that's great. But the minute I start to not do things because I rather daydream, I don't do my work as well as I could if I weren't daydreaming, I'm procrastinating, I'm less efficient. I have a very big gap between how I wish to be as a worker and how I really am. The moment I don't go to a date and I'm not looking for a relationship because I'm having such a hard time to bear the anxiety of looking for a partner, and I do it only in my daydreams and then stay really lonely, then I need to rethink about it. Is that adaptive or not? And it sounds like it's not.
Did any of the people you interviewed had coping strategies or a way that they made it however many years to where they're at now of just making sure people didn't realize it was something that was going on? I'm sure people see everybody kind of tune out for, I mean, that's pretty common, but when it comes to the maladaptive daydreaming side, how do you go, say, 50 years without anyone asking a question if there's something going on with them?
So I think people with maladaptive daydreaming know really well how to mask it while they're doing it. They learned over the years how to mask it so they won't be looking weird in some way. And I think many people who kept on it as a secret had to pay a really high price for being lonely because of that. That's the very adverse outcome of having this secret, that you're very lonely. You have no, when you have no one to share, you're such an important aspect of your life, and that's really hard. The strategies are just to do it when you're alone and not tell people what you're really doing, I think. Maybe telling people that you're reading, or you're watching a movie, you have work to do, I don't know. But you use different things to kind of mask it and not let other people know about it. And sometimes people feel even embarrassed to tell about that in therapy. So they just don't speak about that, as they, or sometimes they think this is might be secondary and not that important. Maybe it's the other things that are important, and they just don't speak about it.
What about mindfulness maladaptive daydreaming, where you're able to do it in specific moments? Like you set out a certain amount of time a day to be able to still do it. Like if I have to think someone that's doing it for however many years every single day in certain moments, that they could slowly try and wean themselves back. I don't think there's really a way to cut someone cold turkey from going inside their own head and exploring and creating a fantasy, but making that person responsible for cutting themselves out a little slice of time to do this type thing and then finding a way to slowly bring that down a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily, like I said, the daydreaming stuff, I think that's good, but I don't, the maladaptive part, the part that becomes very bad, the stuff that hinders your own life, that's where like the line is. So I'm just curious, like not to cut out daydreaming entirely, but slowly reduce it from an extreme point to bringing it down to a more normal point where it's, yeah, that's okay if you're in your head for 5 minutes or something like that, doing something. And then, you come back to reality, but setting aside time. I mean, have you thought about that at all?
My study is not focused on treatment. Unfortunately, that's out of my scope of research, because there is only some work you can do in your PhD. But I think it is really important to have studies on that, exactly on that. How can you control your daydreams pattern much more? How can you have this part of your life not banished, but controlled in a way that's not gonna impair your functioning and not gonna cause you distress? So I don't know how to do it, but I think that in order to find a solution to a problem, you first have to know how to define the problem at the first place, right? If you don't know how to define the problem, how can you solve it? So we need to understand maladaptive daydreaming as a construct, and then I think it will be much easier to find solutions, or much smarter to find solutions once we understand it more.
Has your perspective changed from when you first joined with Ellie Sommer compared to what you've known now about maladaptive daydreaming?
I think at the beginning I was just reading about it, and it sounds like something that I can't really envision in my head how a person that have maladaptive daydreaming will look like, or what will he describe to me. And then when I met people, it suddenly became real, and I got a much deeper understanding of that. It changed in a way that I feel that is real, and I cannot dismiss it. I do sometimes find myself, is that do we know everything? No, we don't. There are things that I don't understand yet. How is that possible? How can I explain that? I find myself asking a lot of questions, but I'm not suspicious towards the term maladaptive daydreaming. And I think what Ellie did was great, because he gave a name to an experience a lot of people have. And that is important. Like, it's validation, which is something very important as therapists to do. And people are having maladaptive daydreaming internet groups they're opening that themselves. It's not like the psychological society tell them this is what you have and you need to have help for that. People are contacting Ellie and Yates by themselves, asking them to help them and reach out to them. So I think this is a very important thing that Ellie did.
I know a lot of stuff doesn't have like either the proper study done about maladaptive daydreaming or something. There's like an area that hasn't been touched or maybe doesn't have enough evidence on it. But I think that only comes with more awareness on it and more acceptance of that this is something. Because then, I mean, think about it. When you were starting out in maladaptive daydreaming, kid could look up maladaptive daydreaming on their phone. Maybe they get a couple articles or get a couple things of work, and then compared to what they can do now, like that's how I try and think of why I think it's so important to me to just learn more about it, is because I understand the experience aspect, but I'm talking about like there's a child out there that's kind of like 7 years old on their phone or something like that because they have a cell phone. And how many studies are going to be able to, come across that they might have this certain thing and be able to understand themselves a little bit more. That's why I think it's an important thing that I hopefully will get accepted as DSM criteria at some point. I mean, do you, besides groups, I know there's a giant forum about this as well too, where a lot of people share stories and experiences, but do you see a lot more of the academic committee through your perspective that is now starting to accept it more, or do you still find that hesitancy?
Um, like with my colleagues, when I told them about my thesis, they were like, wow, I think I met someone with that. So people were starting to be interested, but it takes time to be able to like, you need an interpersonal relationship, I think, at the beginning to help people be more open about it. But I'm sure that as time goes by, it will spread and people will start read about it and might be interested. And it's also okay to criticize that, because we learn from criticism. If someone criticizes me with a question, it means that I have to do more study myself and give and find more answers. And that's a good thing. So I'm not interested only with other researchers saying I'm right. I'm like, having a criticism is a good thing in that aspect. It makes me work harder. So that's also important.
Well, I appreciate the time you gave me to talk on my show about it. And engage me in all types of different areas of maladaptive daydreaming. But is there a place where people can find your links, and then also any studies or anything that you have links to, or anybody else's work that you'd like to promote as well too?
Yeah, sure. So right now I have one study that is still running, and we are looking for participants to participate. So you can find my study links on Netzan Theodor Katz website, and I'm recruiting people for my study, and I would be very happy if people that are listening to your podcast will subscribe to my study and would help me gain more understanding of maladaptive daydreaming and ADHD. That would be great.
Do I fall in the category for that? Because I'll sign up if it's something like that. Like I said, I might have maladaptive daydream, but I sure as hell have ADHD. I can tell you that much.
We'll have to do an interview for that. But I'm looking not only for people with maladaptive daydreaming and ADHD, also people who don't have any of these, but are interested in psychology and understanding their different thought patterns. So I'm also looking for a participant as a control group. So everyone who is interested is welcome to participate.
And I'll make sure I link those links in the description so people will be able to find it, participate as well too. Do you have a Twitter or anything like that? Any social medias?
Oh, I'm so old in my mind. Like I don't even have an Instagram. That's
Look,
how
it's a good thing. It's not necessarily a good one. I just have to ask.
you can find me on LinkedIn or on Facebook, and I can also give you my email address. So people who want to find out more about that can also email me if they wish to do so, and I can explain more about my studies and what I'm studying, or answer their questions regarding study participation.
Awesome. And I'll make sure I link those in the description. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.